everyone, and welcome to this Infosecurity Magazine interview. I'm Beth Mondrell, and I'm really delighted to be joined by Sophos CISO Ross McKerchar. And today we're going to be diving into an issue that's grabbed a lot of headlines and led to some of the most significant breaches we've seen in recent times, and that's software vulnerabilities. So, Ross, I know this is something that you're really passionate about. So, to set the scene, how would you describe the current state of software vulnerabilities across the industry, and maybe what are some of the trends you're most concerned about?
Yeah, absolutely. So my concern is that we as an industry are generating a huge trust issue. When you purchase a product that's designed to protect you and that becomes a product that harms you, it doesn't just harm the vendor that sells you that product. It actually reduces and erodes faith in, the entire digital ecosystem. It makes people kind of feel helpless around what they can do to keep themselves safe. In terms of trends, I think one very concerning trend is historically, I think most of the breaches and incidents, and this is still happening, has been against perimeter devices, firewalls and other edge devices. Now, these are typically on-premise components. And the good thing about these components, if there's a good thing about them getting breached, is that customers can, maybe not fully, but to some extent, there are some things they can do to keep themselves safe. They can patch those devices. They can typically get telemetry from those devices to spot if they've been compromised. They can harden configurations. This doesn't always protect you. Sometimes you can still, you're obviously very reliant on the vendor, but it at least gives you some chance of defending yourself. Some more recent incidents have been very focused on vendor SaaS platforms. And this is like, a kind of level up from a perimeter device in terms of an issue, because there is essentially nothing in the majority of SaaS platforms that you can do as a customer to prevent an incident. You don't have the visibility into what's going on. You don't have the telemetry to spot it typically on your behalf. You are 100% reliant on that vendor to keep you safe. So that to me is a very concerning trend.
And you mentioned there, obviously, it's an issue that affects many cybersecurity vendors, and we've seen that over the last 12 months. A lot of them having to share notification about vulnerabilities that perhaps have been actively exploited. So far, as a cybersecurity vendor yourself, how do you manage this issue?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the first thing I want to say is, Sophos also has vulnerabilities. We've had some serious vulnerabilities over the years. I don't think it's the right behavior to just expect that nobody ever has vulnerabilities. That's just not feasible. All software has defects. What is important is that we are doing everything we can to mitigate the impact to customers of having those vulnerabilities. So the immediate way is how you respond, how a vendor responds to vulnerabilities. And we've spent a lot of time on our response processes to be as robust and hands-on as possible to keep our customers safe. A good example of that is our Pacific Rim disclosure, where we explained how we actually, over 5 years, put in huge amounts of effort to do everything we can to keep our customers safe under a sustained attack from Chinese-based threat actors. So that's probably kind of number one. But the other one is you can actually, I believe, as a vendor, if you embrace the right methods to discover risk, can identify vulnerabilities in a more controlled fashion. A good example of that is, of course, a bug bounty. They're not super comfortable, right? You don't. It's still an external finding an issue, but it's materially more comfortable because you go through a responsible disclosure process, and the majority of researchers are generally, operating in good faith. And there's a whole other set of ways to discover risk. I think of it as like doing everything we can to shake these products as hard as we can and get the bugs out in as controlled a fashion as possible. It's not always as simple as fixing them. Ideally, you fix them when right deep in your dev process is shift left. You've got to accept that's not perfect. It's about having multiple stages and using them all to the full extent.
So when we talk about software vulnerabilities, people often look to secure by design as a solution. It's been touted by governments, including the US CISA, and in the UK, the NCSC has also kind of pushed secure by design to companies as a way of avoiding having all these vulnerabilities in software. How do you perceive the success of kind of that secure by design concept to date?
Yeah, so at Sophos, we're massive fans of it. We really, really thought it was an important part of a wider puzzle. It's not the only answer. I think it worked more for either organizations that were already doing the right thing, or organizations that were kind of doing most of the right things but just needed a little nudge. That's because it gave us this framework to, I mean, for want of a better word, to essentially brag about some of the cool things that we're already doing or wanting to do. I think what people maybe fail to understand if they don't work inside of the software industry is there's a lot of organizational will in most orgs, from the CISO and a lot of the engineers often as well, to do the right thing. And they want to kind of tackle security debt. However, there's always a massive pressure that the PMs are kind of seeing first, the product managers, to build more features. And it's not that the product managers don't want to fix security issues. It's just they're hearing from customers and analysts really loudly that they need to build all these features, and they're controlling ultimately what the engineers work on. And if they're hearing about security features, if they're hearing about features all the time externally, they're always going to prioritize those features. Now, what Secured by Design does is it allows us to talk externally about security initiatives in a very positive way, which then allows the product managers to see the value, because we essentially get kind of some marketing benefit from doing those secure design features. And then the critical part is, and I use this really heavy, I'm kind of giving away some of my secrets here. So I'm hoping the software engineering team and product managers aren't watching this. So essentially, it allows us to put out some commits and push the organization forward. And then I can hold the organization internally to those commits much more robustly because we've talked about them externally. It's way harder for an organization to kind of drop an external commit than it is to drop an internal commit. So I used it as that opportunity to strengthen up and kind of be able to, it's like defensible material for my internal security roadmap. They may have already been on the roadmap, but it's much harder for them to get traded out further down the line if we've talked about them externally. Now, of course, with Scissors had a few challenges, a lot of change over there. I think we haven't quite followed up and continued that initiative as robustly as I wish we had. I know that Scissors kind of getting back on its feet a bit more now, and NCSC are doing some good work here. So I really hope that we do manage to keep it going.
And as we are talking about some of the government initiatives and what they've been saying, the CTO of the UK's NCSC National Cybersecurity Centre, Ollie Whitehouse, has often argued that currently the cost of insecure software, the burden is on the user rather than the developer. So what role should liability play for software vendors when vulnerabilities in what they're offering does lead to breaches and can lead to a mass amount of breaches with the number of people that use their software?
Yeah, absolutely. And Ollie and I talk about this a lot. And I really like Ollie's kind of overall thinking here. I think we're definitely looking in the right place. Maybe where we differ a little bit is I think we need to get to liabilities, but I think there's a lot of other approaches before we go that far. I mean, secure by design being an example of that. Where secure by design falls down maybe a little bit is for the organizations that maybe just aren't giving it any attention. I said before, it kind of helps the orgs that are already trying to do the right thing. But we need to work towards liability slowly because it's very, very easy to get wrong. When you put in a regulatory regime around or liabilities around this stuff, it actually incentivizes a lot of organizations to, I worry it will, to do just the minimal. That's what happens when you make something a necessary. So we need to figure out a way where there is a low watermark for organizations, but that we drag everyone up to. But we don't want to drag the organizations that are generally doing the right thing down to that level by making a kind of overly kind of compliancy legal piece of work. It's I mean, GDPR is kind of a good example because it's kind of related to like data breaches and how people treat data. And then I think overall a lot of good has come out of GDPR, but it has really heavily focused the industry, possibly too much or arguably too much, on pure data breaches when that's not the only security impact. So, for instance, I think Kieran Martin explains this really well. He was actually the ex-CEO of NCSC. He talks about the Irish healthcare breach where people were getting told that the hospital appointments had been cancelled, but don't worry because your email address is safe. And it's just, I mean, that, can you imagine receiving that message? We don't want to get in a similar situation where people are complying to the letter of the law to avoid the liability, but not actually thinking about the true impact to the user. And there's a lot more carrots we can deploy, I believe, to incentivize the right behavior before we have to take out the really big sticks.
So we've talked a little bit about what Sophos does to tackle this issue, what governments are kind of doing in your response to that. But as a community, as a cybersecurity community, and that's including vendors and end users as well, what do you think the top priorities should be for them to start to tackle this issue in maybe a more aggressive way? Because it's not something that's new. It's not something that most of our audience will be unfamiliar with.
I think the way that we do third-party risk assessments is just fundamentally broken. It's resulted in this horrible situation where third-party risk boils down to everybody sending everybody these vast questionnaires where the expectation is that you answer my security is perfect to every single question, and it's often being run. It's either been outsourced or it's being run by teams that aren't even necessarily like security teams. They don't, it becomes just this a team that just handles the process, very much a box checking exercise. And I think we need to get back to a situation where we think carefully about the vendors that really matter, because you can't spend a lot of time understanding the security of every single vendor. It's just too time consuming. And then focusing on what really matters. I'm a huge fan of indicators that I call hard to fake. So I've referred to bug bounties already. It's maybe not the right answer for every organization, but most software organizations, I think it is the right answer to be honest, because you can't fake having a well-funded bug bounty program. It requires you to have really good vuln response, good vulnerability disclosure policies, a mature product security operation. You can't fake having real meaty detail on your trust center. You can fake half a page of marketing gump about how you do the right thing and how you're super extra secure with your military grade encryption. I mean, that's easy, but actually putting in the real detail behind your processes, the artifacts from those processes. So another example that I really like that we've done recently is we're starting to publish detailed root cause analysis on our vulnerabilities on our trust center, not because customers are demanding them, but just as an example of trying to change the dialogue around, look, we have issues. We have vulnerabilities. Everybody has these. Where we're trying to differentiate ourselves is by demonstrating and giving our customers a way of verifying that we are doing the right thing from those vulnerabilities. And as I kind of talked about earlier, that's a bit of a hack for running internally as well, because it's much easier to get the senior leaders in an organization interested in the results of an RCA if you've made external commits. All of a sudden everyone's paying attention and pressure testing and making sure that because the problem with RCAs is they create huge amounts of work for an organization. You get loads of to-dos and then they never get done. But when you stick them on your trust center, I can assure you there's a lot more focus on getting that stuff done. So yeah, to summarize, I think we just need to have a fundamentally different way of holding our suppliers to account, of figuring out which of those suppliers are critical, and basing our third-party risk process on that kind of new way. So it really is a revolution, not an evolution approach for third-party risk management.
Yeah, and a lot of organizations really have got sprawling vendor landscapes. I think it's not unusual for it to be in the thousands, the tens of thousands. So like you said, doing that prioritization is like a good first step. One thing I would like to ask though is if you're a CISO and you're thinking, right, we want to onboard either a new cybersecurity software platform or the business is onboarding something completely new as well. What are maybe some of the first questions they should be asking, and where should they be pushing back in terms of, is this software as secure as it possibly can be?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, shout out the NCSC have got some great guidance on this. I think it's kind of more, yeah, quite modern. It's a good place. It's a good place to start. Questions that I like to ask my security vendors, or my core IT vendors, the ones that are just have a ton of kind of privilege and access into the environment, is actually, so quick aside on the prioritization side. Before we go there, it's important to understand which vendors to ask these questions for. And this is again where too much of a focus, like a legal focus on data protection, can send you in the wrong direction. Because a lot of vendors that have a ton of access into your environment, they don't directly process lots of sensitive data. They're not one of your top GDPR sub-processors, but they have a ton of access into your environment, which means that the blast radius for a breach of them is essentially undefined. They can, an adversary could go anywhere if they compromise that vendor. So that's just a quick tip there. Don't let your legal team define what the vendors are. You need to think about it from like a risk kind of contagion and blast radius perspective. So once you've done that and you get to your critical vendors, types of things I like to ask are, I love to ask the organizational structure question. Now I ask, who is the most senior person responsible, dedicated responsible for security in the organization? And this is kind of a no extremes approach. If that answer is the CEO, that's a terrible answer, because the CEO is not going to spend a huge amount of time on cybersecurity. They've got other things to focus on. But similarly, if that is someone buried deep inside the IT organization, some poor IT manager who's got 7,000 responsibilities, that's also a terrible answer. I mean, I'm biased, of course, but what you're really looking for is a CISO or a CISO equivalent they're full time on this, but they've also got enough, they've got a seat at the table, they've got the executive kind of oversight and remit to make a real difference. And that's very rarely asked about in standard security questionnaires. And then after that, it's back to those kind of hard to fake initiatives. So for instance, bug bounty program, vulnerability disclosure process, really, really important. And then from a feature perspective, it's about and there's been some good work. The industry's really got better at kind of naming and shaming vendors who don't do this, but things like SSO tax, you should not have to pay extra for things like single sign-on or MFA or logging. Vendors that are trying to make you have to pay more to get the secure version of the product. It's just complete insanity. And I think we should collectively punish orgs that attempt to take that approach. Those would be my top tips.
Great, thank you. And yeah, I think we've all come across when you're trying to onboard some kind of software where they say, oh, well, if you want SSO, that'll be an extra X amount per license, which can be quite frustrating. So pushing back on that is a great idea. So finally, then, if we've covered a lot in this conversation, which has been great, and I hope our audience has got some real golden nuggets of advice from yourself there, Ross. But if you look towards maybe the next 12, 18 months, I know it's hard to get your crystal ball out sometimes, but what do you think some of the biggest changes might be in this kind of area of software vulnerabilities?
That's a hard one. I might give you more of my wish list rather than more. Maybe I'm a bit cynical to think all of this will happen, but this is what I would like to happen. So first off, I think SBOMs are very interesting. However, I think our first effort, there's some kind of there's some guidance and potential legislation on SBOMs coming out, particularly from the US government. I think that didn't go down well for very good reasons. I think we need to have another go at that, because I think the fundamental concept is sound. It's just another example of where there's quite a lot of nuance required in how we handle this area. We need to, and this is actually general across the whole idea around how we assess vendor risk. We need to get away from the expectation that everyone is perfect. And also, when as a vendor, we're talking to our customers, we need to get away from the temptation to pretend everything's perfect. And where SBOMs fell down here is that nobody has a perfect SBOM. So just for readers who aren't aware of SBOMs, software bill of materials, bill of materials. They're essentially a kind of programmatic, machine readable format that explains all the third-party software components, typically open source primarily, that go into building your software. And they're never perfect because no organization operating at any scale has all their libraries perfectly updated and patched all the time. And actually, the ones that are trying to do that, there's actually risk on the other end. We'll have seen there's been quite a lot of compromises of some of these package repositories. So actually, it's not necessarily the right thing for an organization to just keep their packages updated instantly. There's risk doing that as well. So, but nobody wanted to be the first person to come out and publicly publish an SBOM that showed that they had vulnerabilities, even though everyone had SBOMs with vulnerabilities. So we need to kind of work through that, and it becomes more a conversation about, yes, it's not perfect, but here's how we know that those vulnerabilities aren't actually a risk to the customer because we've thought about it, we've got the internal processes to ensure that that's mitigated well. So that's one thing I'd love to see us progress towards. I'm getting very sick, and maybe it's just an internal thing, but of like vendors that use AI being like this big deal and this big different thing, because every vendor is using AI to some extent nowadays. So we need to get there's a few valid questions around use of AI that need to work their way into our standard agreements, but it can't be a big separate thing where we just spend tons of cycles asking all these questions and getting nervous about vendors using AI. I always say, actually, I'm also nervous about vendors that they say no to that answer, because I'm like, you're not using AI anyway. You might like get with the times. Like I kind of want you to, so that you're embracing the best technology. So I think that's going to become normalized. It's just part of your standard processes to understand the risk around AI, and we're hopefully going to coalesce around some sensible questions there. At the moment, they're all over the place because everyone's asking different things, and there's just a little bit of a fear of the unknown there. Finally, kind of back to my first point around SBOMs, just that overall maturing of the approach that we take to evaluate risk, and more companies being willing to actually admit that things aren't perfect internally, but that they've got those processes to try, to manage the risk where it's not perfect. Sophos has been trying to do this, but we can't do it on our own, because the more that we go out on the limb and just say, hey, we've got this problem over here, and talk about that stuff publicly, the more that our competitors can kind of almost use it against us as well. And we don't want to get to that situation where maybe the less informed kind of sides of the market are then taking what we're doing as a good thing and trying to use it against us. Unfortunately, that kind of behavior does exist in the industry, and we need to like stamp it out collectively. And the more companies that are taking that approach, the easier it is to be able to stamp out that kind of low rent behavior that we see. As I say, more my wish list. But I do see some good, kind of green shoots towards this. I think the conversation is maturing. I'm seeing less people talk, really kind of simple binary pieces like, oh, that vendor had a vulnerability last year, therefore they can't be secure. I mean, that's not the right way to think. The vendors that have vulnerabilities are often the ones that are doing the good work to disclose them and fix them. It's about how you handle your vulnerabilities. It's not necessarily about whether you had them or not. I'll stop there, but that, you can tell, it's a passionate topic for me. But yeah, fingers crossed we see some improvement in that area.
Yeah, no, it's great to hear your thoughts on this, Ross, because it's a topic that touches every business, because every business is using multiple different software vendors and suppliers for different tasks, and especially those cybersecurity tools as well, which have proven to be vulnerable. But I quite like what you said, like nobody's perfect, but we need to be more transparent and maybe a bit more collective about that transparency as well. But it's such a balancing act with everything, whether it's regulating things or being more transparent. It's finding that line. So hopefully we can work towards finding that line as we look to explore this topic into the future. Thank you so much for a great conversation and insights into this. We'll link some resources for our audience, those NCSC guides, some materials from Sophos as well, in the video description. But for now, thank you so much for watching, and we look forward to seeing everyone again very soon.
Thanks, Beth.